Don, do you remember the first time you saw an inflated gas balloon?
I think that probably was the Secretary of Progress balloon at Soldier Field in Chicago for the 1933 World's Fair. Well, they say that I flew with my mother in 1933, but I don't remember it. I don't think it actually happened. The first flight that I clearly remember is taking off from Lakehurst in a 35,000 cubic foot balloon with helium. Lieutenant Senior Grade Sims, guy from Texas with Wellington boots, was a pilot, taking all of the balloon riggers, just like parachute jumpers have to jump a parachute. They said we had to go for a balloon ride, so the pilot was in the basket.
So when your parents made that historic stratosphere flight, did you realize the dangers of that flight at the time, or do you remember much about what was going on at the time?
Well, I think, well aware. I was 8 years old, but I think I was well aware of what was going on and how it worked. Certainly not aware or concerned about any dangers. My brother and I were there. My older brother wasn't. We knew what was going on. We saw it. Goodbye, Mother. The balloon takes off. But all right, and we go back to some friend's house and spend the day and wait for their landing. We were preparing for my mother's stratosphere flight at the Ford Airport in Dearborn, Michigan. And we were staying at the Dearborn Inn, which Ford, I think, owned or set up. And there was a string of people that came through, maybe especially to meet my parents and to see what was going on. So there were always a lot of known people that you'd know who they were, who were coming to visit. Ed Hill, who was my mother's instructor, was there, and a very strong personality, taught her to fly the balloon. And we were staying at the Dearborn Inn right across the street from the Ford Airport where the balloon was going to fly, and the hangars where they were preparing the equipment. And Dearborn Inn had on display the Gordon Bennett Trophy, which Ed Hill had won. That made quite an impression on me. I remember that. And a lot of people came through. Will Rogers came through, visited, climbed into the gondola, came back out, and he gets out and he puts one foot down and puts his other foot down, and he sort of plants himself. And he says, he said, we didn't leave the ground, but I felt like it's good to be back on Earth. The one that really impressed me was a man who knew that I wanted to be impressed, that I would want to remember, was Orville Wright. And when he was introduced to me, or when I was introduced to him, he shook my hand, and he shook it very hard and firmly and looked down at me, and very nice to meet you. And he knew that years later I would want to remember it. Now, I remember Will Rogers and other people, Bill Stout particularly, of the Ford Trimotor designer. But I don't remember them. I don't remember the incident, but I just knew it happened. But Orville Wright, I remember because he shook my hand very hard, rattled my backbone. He knew that I would want to remember not that it happened, but remember the happening. So that I do remember shaking hands with Orville Wright. And that's always carried with me, but one of the most important points of my life. I served in World War II and in the Korean crisis. I ended up as a bosun mate third class, what they call a coxswain, as a general service. But they wanted me to become an aviation metalsmith, or an aviation bosun mate. And I said, no, that's not my job. My job is with marlin spike seamanship, with manila rope and net and fabric. I'm a job of a sailmaker or a bosun mate. So they let me strike for bosun mate and made third-class bosun mate at the end. I enlisted in the V-12 program in the Marine Corps, and they put me in a Navy V-12 unit at the University of Minnesota, and where I did 1 year, and I went just about stir crazy. I couldn't take it. I'm in Pioneer Hall, and I'm closer to where I live than where my classes are, to my home. I wasn't at home, I wasn't in the military, I wasn't at war, I wasn't in college, and it just drove me. So I left that. They gave me the opportunity, and I chose to go. So I went to Great Lakes, and at Great Lakes they looked at me and said, "Oh, your name's Piccard. Are you into balloons?" I said, "Well, that's my folks." "Oh, well, we'll send you to Lakehurst." So I got to Lakehurst. I said, "Oh, you're Piccard. Well, we'll put you in a balloon loft." So I got in the balloon loft and working under a first-class bosun mate, Giovanni, and he's the guy that, well, I'd already knew how to lay out a balloon, how to put the net, how to valve, and the construction. With the balloon that the University of Minnesota had, for just indoctrination for aeronautical engineering students. The DeFuGirl program was a Japanese program to bomb the western portion of the United States with incendiary bombs, to start forest fires and field fires in the proper conditions. Of any one of them could make California today look like nothing. The Canadian wheat fields, you put down in remote areas, incendiary bombs dropping every 5 minutes as it goes across the country. It could have been disastrous if they had done it during the right time of the year and had continued the program. Balloons were cheap. They cost $175 to make, and they cost far more than that to shoot down if they were able to shoot them down.
So somehow you acquired one of these, and you actually
Well,
brought it
when we
home
were
with
through
you.
with them, they were going to dump them all on the dump, and so I asked for a property pass and took the best one I could find and took it home. When I got out of the Navy and I had this balloon, I went down to the promotion department of the Times, and they knew my name, and told them I'd like to make a balloon flight and would they like to sponsor it. And they said, "Yeah, that sounds like a great idea." So they said they sponsored it, so I worked on the balloon, got a glue company to give me work up some glue that would work on that paper. Acme Metal Spinning spun an aluminum valve for me because the balloon didn't have a control valve. But a hydrogen balloon, just like a hot air balloon today with a big parachute vent, has a little valve to let gas out when you want to go down. Built a balloon based on the basic skeleton of this 19,000 cubic foot spherical catenary curtain. The valve was a nice valve. It was different, but nothing that some other engineer would have done something a little different, nothing important there. The inflation system, I inflated from the side just above the catenary curtain, put the hydrogen in there, and that may have been a first, may have been a novel way to do it, so that if putting the gas in through the appendix is going up inside and problems.
Now, at that time in the U.S., were there other gas balloons being flown? Were there a lot of activity with gas balloons?
No. The balloon clubs that ended up at the beginning of World War II with Cleveland Balloon Club being the only one, and they gave all their balloons to Tony Fairbanks for safekeeping during the war, and he gave them all. His wife didn't particularly like ballooning, and gave them all to the Salvation Army, which they were, I presume, cut up for painters' drop cloths. So there were no other civilian balloons. The Army had gone out of ballooning at the beginning of World War II, so that those Army balloons were belonging to Douglas Day Advertising Company, and that was it. Yeah, it was my first hydrogen flight. Hydrogen has a different adiabatic lapse rate, so it goes up and down a little different than helium. So that was interesting to have. To fly a balloon with a paper surface instead of a metallized aluminum paint. To have a metal basket instead of a wicker basket. There were a lot of things that were different. And it was small, only 18,000 cubic feet, where all my training had been in balloons twice that size with 5 people on board. So there were a lot of differences to take into account. After I made the flight, FAA didn't quite, different people didn't have different ideas, and finally one of them just says, "Oh, what the hell, go ahead." And he took out a form and he signed and said, "There, you're a pilot." So I never took a written exam.
Now, I had read somewhere that there was some connection with the Air Force also with this flight.
Well, I was in the ROTC, Air Force ROTC. Colonel Gerling thought it would be a good exercise for the ROTC students, so he suggested they volunteer as ground crew. So we got some light and air training for the Air ROTC at the University of Minnesota at that time. I wore my uniform, and our ground crew all wore their uniforms. One Navy ROTC student was a friend of mine, he was on, and a couple of civilians. The kid lived next door, Dick Bacon, not Bakken, Bacon, wore civilian clothes, and he served on the ground crew.
What impact do you think that flight had on gas ballooning in the U.S.?
I went to the Daily Times and they sponsored it. And one thing I asked them if they were getting a clipping service. Well, they didn't know what a clipping service was, and explained it. So they went and found a clipping service so that they'd pay 50 cents a piece for clippings from newspapers across the country to show the results of the publicity, how well it worked out. Well, the Daily Times spent more on the clipping service contract than they spent for buying the hydrogen. It was in just about every daily newspaper and every weekly newspaper, front page of the New York Times. You know, it just got tremendous amount identified, so that for years people would remember that they'd seen me in the New York Times or in their local paper, and that they established so that it gave me an entree in many places to meet people, to talk to them about ballooning, trying to get balloon races started. You know, the Thompson Products in Cleveland, the president of Thompson Products, Crawford, entertained me and took me around the whole plant, and was lined up as a sponsor for a gas balloon race, which would have been in 49. They started making these hot air balloons for the government, and the word came out that they were going to make them available as for sport balloons. I said, well, that sounds like fun. After I got to Raven, they had the sport balloon when it was ready. I had one of the military balloons that give me a check flight in, and they told me what to do, get in it, and you fly, you go up 3,000, level out, and then come down, and level out 10, 50 feet off the ground, and then jump out, run like hell to get away from it, then fire the blasting cap to blow the top out of the balloon, and then when it comes down, they'd run back, grab a hold of it. So their procedure, they didn't know how, because the balloons and the programs that they were using, you'd come in with a balloon and you'd jump out before it hit the ground, because they didn't have deflation systems on the balloon. They'd land and let the balloon go. When I made my first flight, I just came in and landed and set it down. I wanted to have a balloon race to promote the sport. I went to the St. Paul Winter Carnival to John Geisler, who was the director, and he said, well, if it doesn't cost us anything, okay, you can have a St. Paul Winter Carnival balloon race. So that I legitimized the sport by having people become sponsors, and they paid a couple $100, I think, to sponsor. And I went down to a jewelry store and bought a 12-inch sterling silver Revere bowl. I wanted to do a trophy like something that Thomas Lipton might have for a yacht race or a horse race. I've been to my aunt's house, and everything on the table was sterling silver that they'd won at different horse shows. That was class. And so I wanted to have a nice sterling silver trophy. Well, when it turned out that the race was going to be on January 28th, 29th, my father's birthday, I said, well, let's have him be the sponsor of the trophy. So we have a university professor presenting the trophy. It's sterling silver. It's not a carnival, county fair, smoke balloon, hot air balloon sort of joke. And I had to overcome that and give it class.
The race day itself, just to get an idea, a comparison to what it was like then and what it's like now?
Well, we just went out to the lake, picked a spot, and looked at the map, and everybody got together and decided where the landing spot would be and picked that, and inflated the balloons and began blowing the wrong direction, and the wind picked up and took off and flew over. One Raven balloon went the wrong way, didn't have enough lift and settled down. Yost went off to the northeast, and I went directly over the target. I could have spat on it. And Tracy, the only non-Raven employee, the college student, just happened to be the one that came and landed right on the target. Everybody claimed that we had fixed it to have the college student win, which was, of course, very desirable from a press point of view, to have the college kid beat out the experts and win the race. Charles Dollfuss was the curator of the French Air Ministry's Museum of the Air and a very popular sport balloonist. Always, all the balloon events in Europe, Dollfuss would be there with his balloon. Had flown me in 1950, given me a ride in the St. Nicholas balloon race with him, where we came in third. And he asked me if the balloon that I had, the S-40, could cross the English Channel. It was 20 miles, we got the right weather, it'd be a 2-hour flight. Yes. And he said, well, what would it cost? And I said, well, we worked out the costs of a sponsorship transporting an S-40 and myself to England. As it turned out, when the program developed, the Navy or whoever sponsored a new balloon, a bigger balloon. So suddenly, instead of Don Piccard going over and flying with the Sport S-40 at Yost, and Don Piccard went over to fly in the S-50.
And the S-50, that would be the Channel Champ balloon.
And that crossed the channel, and then was used in the Catalina Channel balloon race, and won that, and where I christened it the Channel Champ.
Oh, okay.
So after Catalina, it became the Channel Champ. Dolphus then went out to a travel agency and got them to sponsor the flight across the English Channel. He said that if the balloon is capable of doing it, this is a rite of passage which must be done. Whenever something is ready to prove itself, it crosses the English Channel, whether it's a boat or a balloon or an airplane or whatever.
So what makes that English Channel crossing so difficult?
Well, if patience is difficult, then it's difficult. You have to have patience to wait for the right weather. If you take off from a given point in England, you have to have a wind that will take you to France, not towards Denmark or towards Spain, because you're not going to make it. So you want the 20-mile crossing or the 25 or 30-mile crossing. So you have to have the right weather. We'd take off and head towards London. So we got higher, then we headed toward France, and said if by the time we crossed the Dungeness Point coastline, where the Dungeness crabs come from, if by the time we get to be crossing that point, we have to be in line with the 3 points that come out of England into the channel. And if we can line up with those, it's a go. If we can't line up with those lines, we have to land before we get to Dungeness. And it turned out we got to them. Now, once we passed that, it was just a question of going. And we went on and on and on, and finally got over France, and you could see our shadow, and we could see that the shadows of the clouds down at 3,000 feet were heading right back to sea. And I could see the edges of the clouds crossing roads, and how many seconds it took for crossing. Figured they're doing about 30 miles an hour, 66 feet per second. And so we knew that when we come down from 12,000 feet, we had to come down fast, get through that wind, otherwise we'd be back in the channel. So we made a very rapid descent. The banners on the side of the balloon lifted up, tore the fabric, probably the closest I ever came to being killed in my life. Balloon with no load tapes, the fabric being torn, a 3-angle tear from the pin. If it gone just a few inches more, it could have zipped around the whole thing. Final landing was probably 5 to 10, maybe up to 15 miles an hour on very flat ground. There were power poles. Yo says, what are those poles? They're concrete poles. And I says, those are power lines. Hit the burner. Oh, I said, there are no wires. They're brand new poles. Just came down and landed in a field with mud and deflated the balloon into the next field, which was a little higher ground and was dry. One thing that I really insisted on was that we have load tapes rather than just tabs. Rather than having the steel cables come from the burner in the basket up to the balloon and just a little tab there, I wanted a load tape to go all the way over. No, they wouldn't do it, and never did. And finally the program completed, and I went into California and made the first hot air balloons with load tapes, which I think is one of the most important things that I did in my hot air career, was to give the load tapes, which made it a safe balloon. There are many, many lives were prevented loss because of my invention of the load tape. It has not been recognized by my peers. have not recognized and accepted the fact that this was an important thing that Don Piccard did do.
You've always felt, in my opinion, that the competition is important in the sport of ballooning. Could you give us your opinion on that, on competition?
I think that to compare your activity with somebody else's is a natural thing. So that I think that competition is normal and natural. And the simple, basic things of flying a balloon tend to give a good, natural competition opportunity.
So competition today requires a lot of technology in the basket. How do you feel about that?
Well, it's way beyond my capability. I mean, I can send an email, but some of the technical stuff is going past me. And it seems to me it takes up a lot of time. I've raced automobiles, and I can't imagine having a device to sense a curve up ahead and determine exactly how much drift you can, to instrument an automobile race seems to me to be very difficult. But they seem to have done it with balloons. The balloon competition today, where they drop a baggie onto a target, doesn't seem quite right.
So what do you think of like the old-fashioned type of an event where you're in the basket by yourself, you've got an altimeter, a ball variometer, maybe a compass, and possibly a weather forecast? What do you think of that type of competition?
Yeah. Just get to the basics. I like the basics. The others are far too complicated, far too difficult.
When we first
I'd
came
like
in
to
here-
see an event where instead of throwing a baggie, you actually stick a ski pole in the ground without the basket touching. When you're throwing the baggie, you can have a great deal of difference in altitude and to get the balloon over the target. But if you have to put a ski pole in the ground to stick it in, that means you've got to come. Now, it used to be that you'd land on the target, but then you had too many balloons, and you'd get a pile of balloons on that too close. But if in the baggie you've got a great deal of altitude to pick and choose to get your direction. But if you're required to actually put a ski pole with your flag on it in the ground, then you can measure that to the inch, and you can see where it is, and you actually have to have the balloon there, or you would not be able to get it in position. I think that anybody that wants to have a new event race, do it with ski poles for the marking your landing spot. With as many balloons as we have, and with property farmers, you can't have them all land in one field like we did in the original.
Are you happy with the direction that the sport of hot air ballooning has taken?
Yes. Yeah, I think it's great. I think it's doing great. It isn't as widespread as I thought it might be. They say that Albuquerque, gee, did you when you won that first race at Albuquerque, did you think there'd be this many balloons here? And I said, well, there were 13 balloons there at the first race. If each one had brought a buddy next year, that'd have been 26, and if each one there'd be 52, 100. The race with 1,000 balloons would be like small potatoes, being what it could have expanded to if you wanted it to expand that big. But I don't like Albuquerque to fly in. There's too many balloons. There's too much distractions. There's not enough landing space that's wide open for people to land in without getting into trouble. Somebody wanted to have a gas balloon, and I had a gas balloon, and got the gas company to provide the helium at a reasonable price. It was just an added attraction. I think a lot of hot air balloonists interested. A nice thing to entertain them, to see something that they weren't familiar with and see how it worked. With the way things are, sport of gas ballooning is not expensive, so I don't think that they were trying to introduce gas ballooning into the Hudson Fair as a permanent thing. I think it was just a sideshow to let the public and balloonists see the gas balloon, and they had the hot air balloon with environmental effect is wind rather than temperature. But certainly if you're going to be flying in Wisconsin or Minnesota in January, February, it's going to be different than flying in July. Your balloon gets more lift. It reacts to the wind the same way. If you have a 10-mile-an-hour wind, you've got yourself a handful. If you got a 20-mile-an-hour wind, the average person is not going to be able to fly at all. And the landing is going to be trickier with higher wind, and so on. So it's wind speed rather than temperature. The question of what the environment is impacting on you. Nice thing about winter is I've never had to pay for crop damage. They say this is not the season for ballooning. I'd say, hey, it is the season. You're never going to have farmers complain about your landing in this field. A couple of feet deep snow is comfortable to land in.
So in all the flights that you've taken, has there been any flight where the view from the basket was just one of those once-in-a-lifetime, awe-inspiring views?
Every view stands out. Every view becomes common. And yet every flight is spectacular. Every flight is different. This is the thing about ballooning. It is different every time. You can always expect something new, and you don't know what to expect. Now, I guess if you're down the bottom of the basket with 3 computers and 2 GPSs, you might miss it. With balloons, I've never felt danger. I haven't planned to be dangerous. I planned it to be safe, and when it's turned to be a little sketchy, that's been accidental. So I don't get any thrill out of that. What do you call it? Adrenaline rush of something. The peace, the problems in operating, how to get the balloon to get over a little bit to the right where there's a good field instead of to the left where there are power lines. Those are interesting problems you deal with. You don't plan them. It's not on the schedule, but they do occur. It does come up. The peace and tranquility that you're going to have so many times. Having a bunch of birds, a big flock of birds flying around you, just a little disorienting maybe, but still an out of this world experience.